Huzzah. Hope everyone has had a good week and not been snowed in too much. So today is just going to be the second part of our How to Reason Well series of classes. The first one of the first thing I want to do today is just do a little review of the key terms, because really what we're going to be doing today is just kind of going over what we've gone over before, and then just come up with some useful argument structures so that when it comes time to do the homework or it comes time to try to understand arguments in the real world, you've got a little more background of just like you can recognize some of the common sorts of things. So first off, what is meant by an argument? What do we mean by an argument? We've talked about this last few classes, but let's just review. What is it? When I say something's an argument, what does that mean? Any takers?
It's the use of premises to reach a conclusion.
Yeah, it's a use of premises. So it's a way of thinking or a way of reasoning. So that's what we mean by an argument. And what are the two parts of it? Well, we just got the answer: premises and conclusion. So the premises are the things that are true or false that you start with, and the conclusion is the new knowledge that you gain, the new truth that you're trying to reach. What is a deductive argument versus an inductive argument? Now, I talked about these at the end of last class. So anyone want to take a stab at it or come up with an example of one of these things?
Right. I remember what inductive.
Yeah, inductive is perfect.
It's when you use the past to determine what goes on in the future.
Exactly. So that's just a way of reasoning where your premises, instead of being like a general statement or anything like that, are just a lot of experiences or particular events that have happened. So if you're trying to decide like what is going to happen tomorrow, well, I compare tomorrow to the last, or what classes do I have tomorrow? Well, you compare Tuesday to the other Tuesdays you've had, and you do all of that. So that's what is meant by inductive. A deductive argument is the more classic style that we've been talking about, where it's you have one thing that is like a general truth, another thing that's a general truth, and it leads to a conclusion that is guaranteed to be true. So today we're really going to be focusing on these deductive arguments. In inductive argument, the key difference is that the conclusion you reach is very likely, but it is not guaranteed. So it's a case like if I've dropped a pen 1,000,000 times, which I feel like at this point I probably have, there's not a guarantee that it's going to fall on the 1,000,001st time. It could be the case that like for some reason I have super glue on my hand and it stops it or something like that. But that's what's meant by an inductive argument versus a deductive. Now, validity is an idea that applies to deductive arguments. These arguments that you begin from things that are true, and if it's a good argument, your conclusion is guaranteed to be true. So what is meant by validity? What is it for an argument to be valid? And this is really what we're going to be focusing on a lot more this time. But how did we define it last class? Anyone remember? Raph?
That if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true.
Exactly. So all it is for validity is if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Or another way of putting it is if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. You cannot have a false conclusion if you have true premises. If the conclusion is false, then that means the premises must be false. All of that is ways of talking about validity. So that's what we're going to be talking about this class, is giving examples of valid arguments so that you're better at recognizing what arguments are good and which ones are bad. And so what are some examples? Now, last thing, what is it for something to be sound? What is a sound argument? We define it as valid plus.
It's valid and a true conclusion.
So valid and a true conclusion, and the conclusion is true because the premises are true as well. So the key idea with a valid argument is that the premises have to be true, and because the premises are true, the conclusion is true. So yeah, so now what I want to do is just go through some classic types of arguments, how to recognize whether an argument is true or false in practice, and how to get avoid getting tricked when people give you things that look like valid arguments but are not. And so this is really, I don't know how long this will take today. We're just going to go through all of them, come up with some examples, and then maybe do a little practice at the end. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is called, it's a fancy Latin term, modus ponens. Now, what modus ponens is a fancy way of talking about is just reasoning in the following way. So if, so here's going to be an example of it. 1, 2, conclusion. If I was born in the US, then I'm a US citizen. 2, I was born in the US. Conclusion, well, what's the conclusion you can draw from this?
You're a U.S. citizen.
Yeah. I'm a US citizen. So, or you could replace this with you or if a person. So all of these, this right here, this type of thing is just called modus ponens. I don't really care about the name. Some people like the term, but if you ever see the phrase modus ponens, it's just this line of reasoning where you start off with an if blank, then blank, and then the first blank is this, and therefore you can reach the conclusion. This is sort of reasoning we all follow all the time. Now, one thing that is useful to do with any of these valid arguments is to realize that because it follows a certain formula, you can draw this in symbols or think of it in terms of variables or think of it as a structure that can be applied to many things. So anything, modus ponens is simply an argument that is we can say has the following form. If A, then B. So premise 1, 2 is A, conclusion B. This is what modus ponens looks like. And now, each of these variables, this here, this here, this here, and this here, you can think of them, what is a variable in math? Well, in math, if I say x plus y equals z, what do these mean? What does this stand for? What is this in a math equation? It's just a stand-in for any number you want to put there. That's all a variable is. So in the same way, when we're describing modus ponens here, what this is saying is any sentence you put here and any other sentence you put here, if you put this first sentence here again, then the second sentence is guaranteed to be true. So anything you plug in to these variables, as long as it's the same one here and here and here and here, is guaranteed to be a valid argument. So if somebody were to say, if we let, I don't know, what will be some, if we kick puppies, we will be happy. Premise 2, we kicked puppies. Conclusion, well, the conclusion, if this were true and this was true, what else would be the case? Well, it would have to be the case that we are happy. So no matter what you put in here, it's valid. Now, again, this argument is not sound because the premises aren't true. None of us, I think, are, I mean, some of you have your cameras off, so you might be kicking puppies right now, but I don't think most of us are currently kicking puppies. And it's also not true. Kicking a puppy doesn't make you happy. So this argument is not sound and the conclusion doesn't follow, but it's still a valid argument where if this was true and this was true, this would be guaranteed to be true. And this is important, again, because when you're going out and reading things in the real world or watching a video or anything, knowing that it's a valid argument allows you to very quickly judge whether you even have to be concerned with the conclusion. If somebody presents you with evidence, but the argument isn't a valid one, then the fact that they've presented it with you shouldn't sway you or shouldn't convince you to believe a new thing. So if you look at this and you see somebody says something of the form, if A, then B, and A, conclusion B, you know, like, oh, they're reasoning in a way that makes sense. Now, I'm not certain that I should accept their conclusion because it might be the case that their premises are wrong, but this gives you, you know that they're following the right sort of argument. So that's what modus ponens is this way of if A, then B, A, then B. So does this make sense to everyone? Of just like, this should be, and you should, like, if you are a human being, you should reason in this way sometimes in your everyday life. Like, you know, if I want Chinese food, then I have to order from a Chinese restaurant. I do want Chinese food, therefore I'm ordering from a Chinese restaurant. That sort of thing is just everyday, ordinary reasoning. Any questions? Jacques? Anybody? Yeah. All right. So this is modus ponens. And this is an argument structure you can follow and be on the lookout for, because some of the homeworks will follow this sort of thing. So if you look at the homework and see something in this order, it is a sign that, like, oh, it's modus ponens. I know that this is going to be a valid argument. Or if you're reading something in an article about why, I don't know, Kanye West is a terrible person, then you could, you know, use your knowledge that know the author's like, oh, there actually might have a point here, as long as what they're saying is true. All right. One other thing about if-then statements to keep in mind throughout your everyday life is when you're thinking about these things in formula type and going back and forth between like using symbols and using variables in this way, it's important to know that sometimes what you read in actual language is not going to be lined up in this exact same way. So it would still be an instance of modus ponens if somebody were to write the sentence in this way. Instead of having the if at the front, you could say something like, I go to the store if I run out of eggs, or I usually go to the store if I run out of eggs. So in this way, if you were to put this into this format, this part, even though it comes first in this sentence, this is still the first part of the modus ponens because it's the thing that comes after the if. So you could conclude like, I go to the store if I run out of eggs, and I ran out of eggs. From that, you could conclude that I will go to store. So I just want to highlight that the order it's in doesn't really matter. All right, so modus ponens versus so what I just described to you all. Oh, my video's a little funky. Is it back to normal, Antonio? It
Yes,
sometimes
Professor.
goes blurry.
You're all good now. I can see it now.
Okay, awesome. Sometimes if I'm moving too much, it'll go blurry. So if at any point somebody's just like, just let me know if it's going blurry and I'll shut it off and turn it back on. So thanks for letting me know. All right, so this first thing, if A, then B, A, conclusion B, that's modus ponens, and that is a valid form of arguing. What I'm going to talk about now is a type of arguing that people often think is a good way of reasoning, but when you actually pause and think about it, is not actually valid. So, if A, then B, B, conclusion A. So an example of this would be if it's snowing, then it's cold. So this would, in this case, be, I should do this in black.
And you said this was an invalid argument?
This is going to be invalid just so I can contrast the two and show that things that look and feel like they're good arguments aren't necessarily good. And I want to highlight this so we can contrast the two before we move on to the second type of argument. And I want to really highlight this because very often people will use this type of reasoning to try to convince you that something's the case. And this is one of the most common ways that people try to manipulate each other in politics, in advertising, in many, many other things. So this is something that I really want to highlight. If it's snowing, then it's cold. 2, it's cold. Conclusion, it's snowing. Now, why isn't this valid? This line of reasoning, if you start with the premise, if it's snowing, it's cold, and the other premise, it is cold right now, is that a guarantee that it's going to be snowing? No, you can imagine many cases of cold days in which it's not snowing. So when it's presented like this, it can feel like it can be rather obvious that this sort of case isn't what's going on. But the reason that these sorts of things are worth highlighting, and this format is worth mentioning, is because you can come up with many cases in you can come up with many cases, I'm thinking, in politics and in things like that, in which people present this argument to support their conclusion. So let me give an example of this sort of thing in which just to highlight why this sort of case, this thing, it's called affirming the consequent, not important. It's just this sort of if A, then B, B, conclusion A. And this is bad. And why? Well, here's an argument that we sometimes see. If we let terrorists into the US, then, or no, if we let too many immigrants into the US, then the economy will suffer. Or then there will be fewer jobs for US citizens. 2, there are fewer jobs for US citizens. Conclusion, we let in too many immigrants. Now, this right here, to be clear, I'm not endorsing this argument, and I'm not endorsing this line of reasoning or any of the premises that are up here. I'm using this as an example of the way in which people employ this form of bad reasoning to get people on board with their views. So the way good reasoning works is you tell someone something that's true, you tell them something else that's true, therefore convincing them to believe something else. And the thing they believe, you say, this is proof that this other thing is true. And if an argument is not valid, if it's bad reasoning, then you end up with a conclusion that you think is true but isn't. And here's a classic case of this line of bad reasoning. If we let in too many immigrants into the US, then there will be fewer jobs for US citizens. This is a thing that got said by many politicians at various times in our history. And then what people do is they point to the fact that, as a matter of fact, there are fewer jobs for US citizens, which, as a matter of fact, in certain areas of the country, especially former manufacturing areas, this is also true. This is a true statement. And this, in theory, you could argue is true. Like, if we let in 20 million new people every day, then as a matter of fact, there would be fewer jobs for US citizens. Like, that is just a scientific fact of math. So you could say this is true. And people say, well, look, this one's true and this one's true. Therefore, this is proof that we have too many immigrants in this country, and therefore we need to build a wall. And if you actually pause and think about it, though, even though people were persuaded by this line of reasoning, it is not good reasoning. It is not good because it follows the wrong format. It's designed to look like Modus Ponens, but it's not. Because what can you conclude from these two premises? Or what does this actually tell you? If there are fewer jobs in the United States, does that necessarily mean that's because of the number of immigrants who entered? What else could have been the cause of this?
Jobs leaving the US?
Say that again.
Jobs leaving the US?
Yeah, jobs leaving the US that has nothing to do with immigration. It can be a fact that just like the nature of US manufacturing and the nature of, well, basically one of the major reasons of why jobs are leaving the US is because US workers demand a certain level of pay, and there are places in the world in which companies can get by paying their workers significantly less than that, thereby increasing their profit. So it's got nothing to do with the number of immigrants in the United States. It's got something to do with the number of jobs that are going overseas. Also, things like the number of robotic construction workers these days. There's a lot of jobs still in factories, but these are more overseers and robot technicians, because nowadays, like, you go and like look at a car factory, it's a lot of robots doing the work. So what these sorts of lines of argument do is, if somebody presents this to you, you might feel like, oh, that is proving my conclusion, but really it's not. And so this is something to keep in mind. This case of, I'm gonna write it up once more. If A, then B. A, B. If A, then B, B, A. Which of these is the good one? Which is the bad one?
The first is the good one, the second's the bad one.
Correct. Good. Bad. So when you're, that's not how you spell bad. You know, it's been a long day when you can't spell the word bad. When you're going through the homework or when you're reading something, ask yourself, like, you can actually, reading a sentence, construct it into this sort of form. You can go, all right, what is the structure of this person's argument? What is their approach they're taking? Are they taking a bad one, in which case I know that their conclusion isn't something I should accept, regardless of what they're saying here, I just should not follow along with their reasoning? Or is it a good one? Other sorts of cases in which this type of affirming the consequent, we'll talk about it more later in the semester in terms of advertising, but something like a beer commercial in which you have, like, if you're beautiful, then you drink our beer. Here's people drinking our beer. Therefore, you can conclude, oh, I must be a beautiful person. No, you can't. That's running it the wrong direction. All right. So does this make sense to everyone? And again, this is just to kind of make you familiar with what sorts of things you should look for. Everyone on board so far? All right.
Yes.
All right, great. Another good one, which is also of the if A then B variety, is let's go this 1, 2, conclusion. If A then B, not B, conclusion, not A. So why is this a useful, or why is this a valid argument? Valid. Well, an argument of this form is, you can kind of stop and think about it. So let's use an example and we can reason our way through and why you know that this is going to be a valid argument. Let's come up with an example. If if something breathes air, no, something breathes water, then it's a, no, that's not true though, that's a problem. If something has feathers, then it's a bird. 2. Tim doesn't have feathers. Conclusion, Tim is not a bird. So, does this line of reasoning make sense to everyone? Where if you start off with if A, then B, and you know that B's not true, it couldn't have been the case that he's a bird. Because if he had been a bird, he would have been guaranteed to have feathers. Does this make sense? Like the idea is that if you know that you could reason backwards where because of this if-then statement, if this had been the case, you could have known that was the case because it goes the other way. But the fact that it doesn't, or I guess more accurately, the fact that this isn't true means that that couldn't be the case. So in the same way of like, if you are born in America, then you're a US citizen. But I wasn't born in America, therefore, if you're born in the US, then but I'm not a US citizen, therefore I know I wasn't born in America. Or if you have $100, then you're not broke. But I am, if you have $100, then you are not broke. But I'm not broke. Therefore, I know that I'm confusing myself. But do you understand the line of reasoning here, everybody? Nicole.
Would that only work in the case of if A, then B, not A?
Yes, it doesn't work in the other direction. You mean not A, then not B?
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's run that one here.
But
So
isn't it like in the example you gave, wouldn't that be if not A, then it's not B?
Thank you. Doesn't have, Tim isn't bird. Tim has no feathers. Thank you. I just I just did the exact same thing that's not allowed. So thanks for catching that, Nicole. So yeah, if something has feathers, then it's a bird. He isn't a bird, so therefore you know he doesn't have feathers. The other way doesn't actually work because in that case, let's go back to my original messed up one. If something has feathers, then it's a bird. Tim has no feathers. Conclusion, Tim isn't a bird. Why is this not a good argument? What could we have done to poor Tim that would have changed his feathers, but not changed whether he's a bird or not? What could we have done to poor Tim? What might Tim be? Well, what could you do if you got your hands on, if Tim is a chicken, could you make him a featherless chicken?
Yeah.
Yeah, you just pluck him. If you pulled out all of his feathers, Tim could be a bird, he'd just be a poor featherless bird. However, if you know he isn't a bird, then working this way, you know he doesn't have feathers. So this one, good. This one, bad. These are just, again, things to keep in mind. So just to go, it's if A, then B, not B, not A, therefore not B. Bad. If A, then B, not B, not A. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, conclusion. Good. All right. So is everyone on board with what these different ways are? Just like there are 4 different ways of doing it. I'm going to put out some examples. And then we're just going to work through one, talking about what, we will put up an example. Then we can work together to put it into this if A, then B form. And then from there, we will decide as a group, is this valid? Is this not valid? All right. We ready? All right.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, 1. If your professor puts up the wrong thing, then people get confused. 2, people are confused. Conclusion, your prof put up the wrong thing. Is this a valid argument?
No.
Well, what is the structure of this argument? Which is A, which is B?
Just A. I mean, essentially, it's because there's other reasons you could be confused. So I'm just trying to pick the right.
Yep. Yeah, you're jumping ahead, and Joe, you're spot on. Okay. So there could be other reasons you're confused. So, but let's just break it down. Yeah. And Joe's right. This is not a valid argument. So why? Well, here's your prof puts up the wrong thing. Then people get confused. So using our thing, which of these? Your prof put up the wrong thing. So this one down here corresponds. Well, first off, if A then B, which is A.
A.
And then
one's B, right?
B. And so then what is 2? Comparing it up to here, that's B and A. And this we said, not allowed. This is not good reasoning. And if you pause and think about it, you can see why it's not good reasoning, because people could be confused for other reasons. People could be confused because, we've been in lockdown for 12 months and your brain stopped working. It could be that you decided the best way to get through class during lockdown is to consume an adult beverage before you begin and you accidentally had 14. These are there are many other reasons you could be confused. And so one thing I wanted to highlight here is don't let your knowledge of the actual case confuse you as to whether the conclusion is true. So in this case, you just watched me put up the wrong thing. However, that shouldn't affect the fact that this structure is still invalid. Don't let the fact that you know that something is true affect whether the person is concluding or reasoning in a good way. Or also, this is actually tied in with a psychological thing that's worth talking about, which is called we'll come back to this later in the semester, but I want to write it down. Why can I not think of its name right now? Give me 1 second as I stand here awkwardly. Confirmation bias. How many people have heard of confirmation bias? This is not something that's directly related in. What is confirmation bias? Anyone want to give it a shot, Roy?
Confirmation bias, isn't that where you believe the thing that you
I guess the thing that you believe is what you originally only want to believe in. That's it.
Yeah,
I would imagine.
So it's a psychological principle where people are far more likely to accept something new that goes along with what they already believe, and far less, and that also means they're far less likely to look very carefully at an argument that is in line with their beliefs already, and far more likely to put a lot of effort in to disprove somebody who disagrees with them. So in like a classic case, if you give somebody, if you give a racist a lot of evidence that racism is stupid and that all the things they believe about race and essentialism and like people of this race are essentially different from that, if you give them a scientific argument trying to disprove it, they're very, very, they're going to look at it very closely and do everything they can to prove that it's wrong. If, however, you tell them that your neighbor who's of the race they hate did something bad, they're never going to check your story. They're not going to fact check. They're just going to accept it straight off. And one of the reasons, so this, because of this psychological principle, we often end up continuing. This is one of the reasons why it's so damn hard to stop people from being racist or sexist or bigoted, because the fact that you already believe something affects your train of thinking. And we have to work against these things when we're trying to gain new information. And so if somebody is a Democrat and you give them like an article about why Joe Biden is great, they're very unlikely to go through it with a lot of like close scrutiny. They're just going to take it and be like, oh yeah, I already know Joe's great. I don't have to look at this terribly closely. If you give them an article about why Ted Cruz is great, they're going to look at it really closely and try to prove to you like Ted Cruz isn't great for this reason. He's not great for this reason. But even if Joe Biden was guilty of similar things, it would still be the case that like this person shouldn't have accepted that conclusion. So that's why I wanted to put up this example is when you're judging validity, make sure to focus on the structure, not on the quality of the argument. And that's the best way to make sure that you don't fall prey to confirmation bias and you don't end up stuck in your ways, because it's always important whenever you're going around the world, not just to take things as they are, but to try to gain new information, to try to succeed. If you might be using this deodorant for the longest time and therefore you are going to defend, you're not going to look very closely at things that say your deodorant's good, but you're going to work really hard to argue against it being bad because it's the one you've already used and yada yada. So just keeping this in mind when you're doing these sorts of things. All right, let's put up another one.
Professor,
Yes.
quick question. Before you erase that, could that have been good if where you say people are confused on like the fourth line, if you said people aren't confused?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so people, if your prof puts up the wrong thing, then people get confused. Line 2, let's change 2 to people are not confused. Therefore, if people aren't confused, and anytime the prof puts up something wrong and people are guaranteed to get confused, then the fact that you know nobody's confused means your prof did not put up the wrong thing. So yes, that is spot on. Very good catch. So that's a very good example to show. Oh, I nearly just shut everything off, which would have been a disaster. It's a problem when you're like working in a small space and there's cords everywhere. One of these classes, like if I ever just disappear off the screen, I'll probably pop back up. But if I'm gone for a few minutes, like just try to let somebody know that I knocked myself out. All right. So exactly. Because what would be the formula of this valid one? What is this? Well, if A, then B. And what's this? This is not B. And we said going from not B, you can conclude not A. So again, that's another nice clear one. All right. So those were 2 examples of this type. I now want to talk about 2 other types of reason, or 2 other valid argument forms, some of which will come up in the homework. And these ones are probably even a little simpler than that one. Well, this is one that we talked about last time, I think. Premise 1, A. Conclusion, A. Everything if you start with something, then you can still conclude that this is the case. Here's another one which can be a pretty straightforward. This one doesn't come up that often except when somebody's trying to be really annoying. But one, not a conclusion. Well, if it's not a, what can you conclude? If
That
it's
it is A.
yeah, that it is a. So that's another one. That's called double negation. So like if I'm not American, that means I am American. If I'm not annoying, that means I am annoying. So those are two simple ones just to keep an eye out for. We won't really encounter those in this class, but they're just useful to know. These, however, are more useful. So A or B, not a conclusion B. Or 1, 2 conclusion. So what would be an example of this one? An integer is odd or it's even. 8 is not odd. Conclusion, 8 is even. So, does everyone understand this line of reasoning? It's just basically anytime you have an or statement, the way that an or statement is true is as long as one of the two sides is true. So if you know that the whole thing is true, and you know that one of the sides is false, then the other side has to be true. So a case of this would be an integer is odd or an integer is even. 8 is an integer that is not odd. Conclusion, we know it's even. So this is a useful line of reasoning. This is a valid form of reasoning that I want to highlight because later in the semester, we're going to be talking about a type of reasoning that looks similar to this, but is not valid. So everyone, like this one should be pretty straightforward because this is literally like a sort of reasoning you use in your everyday life. So imagine you've lost your wallet. You don't know where it is, but you have 3 rooms in your apartment. You have a bathroom, a bedroom, and a living room. So where does that mean you haven't left the apartment in 2 months because it's COVID and you're a good upstanding citizen who's not spreading COVID everywhere. And for some reason you grow your own food or whatnot. So you haven't had to go out in 2 months and you've suddenly misplaced your wallet. I have to order something online. I don't know. So if you're in this room, in this situation where you have 3 rooms and you haven't left in 2 months, what do you know about your wallet? Where could it be?
In one of the 3 rooms.
Yeah, so wallet is in bedroom or living room or bathroom. Now, if you were a person in this situation, how would you go about trying to find your wallet? This is
3 rooms.
Yeah, you go and look through the 3 rooms. If you go to the bedroom and you see it's not there, what do you now know that you didn't know before?
It's not in the bedroom.
It's not in the bedroom. Not in bedroom. 3. Well, now you're going, for some reason, you think your wallet might be in the bathroom. I don't know, maybe it fell out of your pocket into the toilet. But you check, it's not there. So what do you know now? Not in bathroom. What do you now know? Which room do you know you have to look for because that's where the wallet has to be?
Living room.
The living room. Living room. Wallet in living room. This is another form of perfectly, this is what's called, if you want a fancy term, again, I don't care about fancy terms. I think they're just confusing. but some people really like I remember when I was taking notes, I like to have them because they were good for like breaking up the page as I was writing. So if you're that person, you want a label, it's called Disjunctive Syllogism. And so anytime you've got an or statement, and then you get rid of however many parts of the or statement minus one, you are guaranteed to have a valid argument. So this would be valid, and as long as these three were all true, your conclusion is guaranteed to be true. So this would be a valid argument. Now, it wouldn't necessarily be a sound argument if you had a fourth room. If you also had, I don't know, a second bedroom. In that case, it could be the case that it's not in the bedroom or in the bathroom, but it still wouldn't necessarily be in the living room because maybe it was in the other bedroom. So this is another type of perfectly valid reasoning, which should kind of go with our common sense. Like if all these cases are true, like if this one's true and you've crossed off the other ones, the conclusion seems true as well. It just seems like a useful, this one should sound pretty commonsensical. All right, the last one that is yes.
If A then B not A, is there like a name for that?
Say that again.
For the if A then B not A, for that form, is there like a specific name?
Is that the bad one?
That's the I have written that's like
okay,
the one to follow. Right?
All right, sorry, my mind has just decided to like fall asleep. If A, then B. All right.
And then it's not B, and then
not
it's not
B,
A.
then conclusion, not A. Yes, this is called Modus Ponens. That is that one's name, if you want the names.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, also sometimes, if you ever want to take there's an entire class called formal logic, which is basically one of the things it really focuses on is turning more complex sentences into these sorts of logical forms. And in that, they come up with all sorts of different symbols to replace words of regular language. I have done this because you have to do it if you want to be a philosophy major or if you want to go into philosophy. And because I've done it so much, I sometimes accidentally fall into using the symbols of it. So if you ever see me use a symbol on a board as I'm writing, you're like, what the hell is that symbol? Just be like, Professor, what the hell is that symbol? And I'll put it back into English. Not. So just for future reference, if ever I do this, it means not. That's one of the symbols for this thing. If ever I do, well, this one's pretty easy if I can actually manage to do it. And means and. This also means and. If I do that, again, if you don't remember this, doesn't matter. And then this is the symbol for or. So if you're ever like, why is there a V in the middle of that? That's just a symbol for or. Again, I'm not expecting you to learn any of those. That's for a different class. This is just if you want to better understand when my brain goes off the rails, what it means. All right, so that is another one. Now, the next one I want to talk about is what is called hypothetical syllogism. So hypothetical syllogism is of this form. If A, then B, and if B, then C, conclusion, if A, then C. This is another valid argument for. So to give an example from English, or in the English language, if I drink milk, I feel nauseous. I have no idea how to spell this word. I feel ill. 2, if I feel ill, then I want to go to bed. So 3, if I drink milk, then I want to go to bed. That is another valid argument form. If I drink milk, I feel ill. If I feel ill, then I want to go to bed. So therefore, I can conclude that if I drink milk, I'm going to want to go to bed because it's going to cause me to feel ill. And if I feel ill, I'm going to want to go to bed. So again, pretty straightforward. And we use this in our everyday line of reasoning. You often will explain to some, like, if you watch a parent explaining to a child why the child shouldn't put some random object in their mouth, it's usually something like, if you put that in your mouth, you'll feel ill. And if you feel ill, you're going to regret it. Or if you keep yelling, I'm not going to buy you a toy. And if you don't get a toy, you're going to be sad. That's perfectly good reasoning. So this one, as I said, is called hypothetical syllogism. So does everyone just generally understand what each of these different argument forms is? Because that's really what the key, and these don't really have opposites that you have to worry about. It was only in the Modus Ponens case. Now, if I'm just going to give a preview of why we're talking about these little argument forms, what I want to do is just talk about the ways in which, in real life, what you're going to see is these can be, think of them like Legos. Does anyone even play with Legos anymore? Do you know what I'm talking about? Those little toys, like back when people played with physical objects instead of computers, and we actually saw each other and we touched things. When you take the little blocks and you put them together, you can use things that were originally small and make something much larger. It's the same with arguments. What you can do with an argument is combine all these different parts together into something that is much more complicated. So you can combine something like a hypothetical syllogism with something like Modus Ponens to prove some conclusion. So when you're actually using it in practice, you're going to be able to combine them together. And when you're reading something or seeing a video, people will combine them together to try to get you to conclude something you didn't have before. And because of this, it's useful to know the little parts and how they work so you can see them stuck together. So just to give a simpler example.
Does that say valid? Sorry.
Say that again?
Does that say valid or void? Right where the V word is?
Yep. That's supposed to say valid.
Okay,
but I can't spell and I can't write. So, thank you for catching that, Valerie. So yeah, again, there are going to be times where I write things that just make no sense and you're just going to have to let me know that I'm incompetent. The good news is I don't like to be a hypocrite. So if you misspell things on your papers or homework, I'll never take off points because it would be very unfair of me to suddenly care about those things. So yeah, don't ever worry about spelling things right. I really don't. I think spelling is dumb. So anyway, so just to give an example of what I mean by them going together, let's go back to that case of a mom and her child in a supermarket, and the child starts screaming. So you can imagine the mom saying something like this. Actually, let's not even label it here. If you keep screaming, I won't buy you a toy. If don't get a toy, you'll be sad. And you are still screaming. So if you can imagine, you have these three, like if this was a string of sentences that the mother has presented and all of these things were true, well, you can think of this as an argument. So we've got three sentences up here, and they all actually that are valid. The following conclusion would be valid. The conclusion that the child will be sad is a valid conclusion. If this is the conclusion, or I mean, if this is the three premises and this is the conclusion, that is a valid argument. Or another way of putting this, if you knew these things, if you keep screaming, I won't buy you a toy, and if you don't get a toy, you'll be sad, and you're still screaming, you could conclude, watching this, the child's going to be sad when it gets home. And why? Well, because if you actually line them up, if you keep screaming, then I won't buy you a toy. That's one sentence. So we can treat that as a single premise. And what's the form it's going to be? Well, it's an if-then statement. So here's A and here's B. And then we can look and see this case. If you don't get a toy, well, don't get a toy, don't buy you a toy, or if you're not bought a toy, this is essentially B. And then this is something new. So this is C. So if we combine these together, just these ones, we know that if you keep screaming, you're going to be sad. And so from here, we reach a temporary conclusion of if you keep screaming, then you'll be sad, because that was the hypothetical syllogism. And so now we've got an if-then statement of right here, and we combine it with you are still screaming. So then what we've got is a case in which this could go in here and give this conclusion using modus ponens. So does everyone understand? Like, I'm not asking you to write down this detailed case. We're going to talk about more complex ones next time. But you see why I'm presenting these, so that you can see how they fit together and how they can be combined. Because when you're like engaged in a complex conversation with someone, they're basically going to be like, you and your friend are arguing about whether the Knicks are going to be good next year. They bring up a few things, you bring up a few things. What you're doing is combining these different lines of reasoning. If you say, well, if the Knicks get a center early in the, or the Knicks get a good point guard, then they'll be good. And they're going to have a good draft pick. Therefore, they're going to get a point guard. And then the other person's going to respond with something like, but all this other stuff is true. So that sort of thing is combining these different sorts of principles together in a more complex argument. All right. Any questions at this point? Comments, concerns, feelings? So the way the homework, let me pull up the homework on my end. So the homework should have popped up on the blackboard right now. So in this case, it's really just going to be a matter of I'm presenting you all in the homework. I mean, I can show it to you. It's going to be a bunch of different arguments. Some of them are going to be deductive arguments. Well, I guess I'm going to give you a bunch of sentences in a row. It's going to look like that. I mean, you can find this up on the blackboard. I could share my screen, but I'm running too many screens for that. So what your job is going to be is read this over and identify whether or not it's an argument or not is the first step. Then the second step is this a deductive argument or an inductive argument? And remember, a deductive argument is one of the ones of this style where it's going to be, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. An inductive argument is one in which you're using past experience to reach a, you're using past experience to draw a conclusion about something in the future. So that's the first step. And then once you do that, you have to tell me whether or not the argument, well, if it is a deductive argument, is it valid? If it's a inductive argument, is it cogent? And I talked about this at the end of last class, so let me just review it very quickly. A deductive argument is a good one when it's valid. And valid is what we've been talking about. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. An inductive argument is cogent if you have a lot of previous cases. And that's just a matter of basically anytime you're dealing with experience, the more times something's happened in the past, it's more likely to happen in the future. So if every single time you've kicked the wall, your toes hurt, and you've done it 1,000 times because you're like me and you're a klutz, then you have pretty good reason to think it's going to hurt next time. But if for some reason if you drive a car, are you going to crash it? Well, if on the first time you ever drove a car, you crashed it, that one time alone is not good evidence that you're necessarily going to crash it the next time. If you've driven a car 100 times and every time you've crashed the car, you have pretty good evidence that you shouldn't drive a car ever again. So that's what cogent means, is just the background. And then, so that's what the homework is going to be. These 10 sentence pairs in which you just have to tell me, is this an argument? If it's an argument, is it deductive or inductive? If it's inductive, is it cogent? If it's deductive, is it valid? And for testing the validity, that you should be able to use the various different types of arguments we talked about today in your attempt to say whether it's valid or not. Now, I'm not asking you to tell me which one it is. I'm not asking you to tell me like which rules you use or why it's valid, just valid or invalid. Now, whenever you have a homework and they're worth many points, basically I want to give you as much partial credit as I can if you get it wrong. So if you include no work whatsoever and you get it wrong, I can't give you partial credit. But if you include a little explanation of, and here's why I think this, then even if you didn't get it right, I'm more likely to be able to give you extra credit. So that's really the last thing I want to say on that point. All right, I have nothing else I need to say now. You've gotten your spiel of logic for the day. We do not have class on Wednesday. I will not see you for a week. You do have a homework due on, I guess, Saturday morning or Friday night. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about the homework, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I will just see you all next Monday. Have a great rest of your week. Hopefully it stops snowing. I feel like I haven't seen the ground in weeks. Snow's one of those things that starts great, and then within like 4 days, especially in the city, as soon as it just turns that like special grayish brown city snow color, like I feel like that would be like a great Crayola crayon color, like dirty city gray. I feel like everyone who's ever lived in the city would know exactly what that color is. All right, have a good one, everyone.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Absolutely.
Good night,
everybody.
Bye. Have a great night.